Welcome back to the My Move Fall webinar series hosted by the HP Collective. Today's webinar is the fifth in a series of 6 episodes. Our host, Greg Dreyer, the founder of My Move, is here to discuss a very important topic today, celebrating all forms of movement and physical activity. We'd like to start by thanking our listeners for their support over the last several weeks as we've launched HPE Radio. We actually have just surpassed 100 listeners this month, so we hope that you'll continue to listen and share with your friends. It's my pleasure to introduce you to my friend Greg Dreyer for this quick webinar today.
Thanks, Jordan. And introduction done, title presented. It's on the screen, celebrating all forms of movement and physical activity. And we're going to dive into physical activity analytics, and then really try to begin to understand how and why we might value certain forms of activity over others. But I feel like I'm stealing my own thunder, and we should just get going. And I'm going to try, Jordan, if it's okay with you, to be a little bit more conversational this week. So put your thinking head on, because I might be coming straight to you.
Yeah, sounds good.
So what type of movements tend to be celebrated most? So in my research for this, starter for 10, what do you think is the most commonly taught activity in US PE?
My first thought trends toward basketball. Mainly because the setting, our gym classes are primarily tied to the physical location of the basketball court. And while that's common, I'd love to see that be changed. Like we don't necessarily have to be on hardwood with basketball goals surrounding us, but yeah, that would be my guess.
Well, spot on. And fitness and exercise was up there. And soccer was pretty high as well, according to the data that I turned to. But this question asks what types of movement tend to be celebrated most. And clearly, hopefully, people listening will just take a moment, maybe hit pause, and just try and unpick that. How would you unpick it, Jordan? What types of movement?
My lean starts to go toward like parsing out like team sports versus individual sports versus expressive movement, like starting to piece together some categories that people would typically move within to kind of define like types of movement. And then I guess, fitness and exercise has its category, but I don't typically tend to think like very narrow sport specific lane. It's kind of like these broader categories.
Okay. And in society at large, what type of movements tend to be most celebrated?
I think I would lean toward this idea of the competitive team sport realm. And maybe I don't know how to define that as a type of movement, but I think just our culture in the United States is really wrapped and revolving around a lot of college athletics. LeBron James in the NBA, you've got the NFL. Pro sports leagues really drive a lot of the perceptions about movement, and so I would trend toward that team sports area.
I would tend to agree. And I would say that was in varying degrees. It seems to be quite universal. A lot of the stuff when I was preparing for this, and I've been quite conscious of it over the last 4 weeks, is like these themes are rolling and they sort of lead into each other. So last week we were talking about gendered activity and gendered activity gaps, and I guess it's like a jigsaw, and the more we dive into each part, the bigger the picture gets and the more connected the picture gets. So even in your, I don't know how conscious you were of it, I'm guessing you were reasonably conscious, but we tend to celebrate male sports take a lot of column inches, they take a lot of media inches. Now, that's not to say that female competitive high performance sport is not celebrated, but I think we're still hard pushed to look at the amount of commercialization in some of the names you mentioned there, the NBA, the NFL is just streaks ahead. The English Premier League is streaks ahead of its female competitors, and indeed, I think I'm right in saying, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that the NFL doesn't have a female counterpart. Is there pro football in the States for women?
The average listener would not know that. There are some female football leagues that I would not assimilate to be professional sport in the common sense, but they do have leagues where women compete in football. Specifically, I think it's a lot of flag football.
Yeah, and indeed in the next Olympics, flag's going to be male and female flag's going to be a medalled sport. So I'm always really curious when I look at US universities and I look at their athletic program, that I don't think I've ever seen NCAA women's football, but I feel like we're sort of going down a little bit of a rabbit hole here. So what type of movements tend to be celebrated most? Competitive athletics, team games, highly commercialized stuff really fuels the celebration, right? Now, how does that relate to phys ed? Well, as we all know, we don't operate in vacuums. So last week you were talking about different gender approaches to a volleyball club, where the boys were coming in, and for them it was about beating their opponents and playing competitive volleyball, and for the young women you were teaching, it was more joyful. They may or may not be conscious of the score, cognizant of the score, really busting a gut to win the game. But I don't know, I'm not there, but there's a lot more around the meanings that they take from it. So that's the backdrop of this conversation, I suppose. And I'm going to redo this slide. That's another thing I've done every week. I've picked up themes through the slides. And so this is the levels of engagement and the amount of dropout. And we know that most young people are not active, and that a lot of those who are drop out, especially of organised competitive sport, between the ages of around 12 and 17. And that's been a trend for many, many years. You hardly find a PE teacher who's not aware of that. That attitudes change throughout adolescence. And all of these webinars, I guess, have been bound together by the question of what role do we play in these unwanted outcomes? And celebrating certain types of activity over others may unwittingly be a contributing factor. So I went to Shape again, and this is their features of a well-designed PE program. Meet the needs of all students. Really, really important. That's the first thing. Inclusion. And I'm going to come back to that in the next slide or two. Keep students active for most of physical education class time. Fine. Active learning, well-established principle. Teacher self-management emphasizes knowledge and skills for a lifetime of physical activity, and it is an enjoyable experience for all students. Okay, so I'm going to say the first and last bullet points are closely connected. Meeting the needs of all students and enjoyment for all students. But how PE grapples with this notion of lifetime physical activity is one of the areas I'm really, really fascinated with. And, I remember listening to a wonderful podcast with it was interviewing a guy who was widely regarded as like the godfather of PE sports sociology. And he was asking the question around if most adults, their physical activity behaviours and the physical activities they take part in are vastly different to what kids do at school. So the question he asked is, to prepare kids for a lifetime of being physically active, should a 14-year-old do the same sort of activities as a 44-year-old? And he said, to unlock that question, you have to ask a 44-year-old, what was it that turned them on to physical activity when they were 14? And it probably wasn't the same sort of activities. It's all about that word that we've used a lot over the last few weeks, the relationship one has with movement, and the relationship one has with their bodies, with one's own body in movement. And for some young people, the highly valued forms of movement, competitive games activities, give an awful lot of joy and an awful lot of meaning, but possibly and probably not for all. Because again, around the world, PE tends to be really games heavy, and one of the exercises I always do with pre-service and in-service, well, more in-service teachers on PD sessions, is to try and look at the weighting of the curriculum. So how much time what percentage of time is spent in games activities? And in my experience, when teachers do this, it's at least 60%. Sometimes it could be up to 80% in team competitive games. So you touched upon categories of activities, and this is not scientific. I was a little bit tight of time, and I was trying to go to, like, how do we understand forms of movement? So in order to celebrate all forms of movement, we need to be able to conceptualize groups of movement, as you touched upon before. And I always think this is a fascinating conversation around, well, I guess it's a little bit academic, but what's the difference between, so at the top here, I've spoken about intentional physical activity. And for me, that's when a person, and I'm most interested in young people, actually decide they're going to take part in physical activity, and the engagement is the primary reason, it is the primary intention. So it's a very conscious thing. Doesn't need to be formalized, but it's a very conscious thing. So then if we come down, I've split physical activity and sport. And, you know, one of my conversation starters, I guess, in PD sessions is like, what's the difference? So I'm going to bump that to you. How do you conceptualize the difference, Jordan, between physical activity and sport?
Yeah, so I think you kind of have to do some mixing here, like understanding that if you're engaging in sport, you're engaging in physical activity for sure. However, not all physical activity is sport. And just to give yourself permission to make that understanding within yourself is what kind of unlocks some of the things that fall below this. You know, I like to talk to my students about identity and culture. And number one, identity. Like on one of our previous slides you just went through, 81% of 11 to 17-year-olds would not describe themselves as active. Well, why is that? Well, maybe it's just because they don't have the language to do it, and they believe that they have to be engaged in organized sport to call themselves physically active. And so once we can parse this out with them, they're like, oh, well, I guess I am physically active. You know, I was talking to one of my students, Oliver, over fall break a couple of months ago. I was playing disc golf at Veterans Park here in Lexington, and I look over while I'm throwing a shot, and down in the creek is Oliver and his family. They all have their shoes off. They're just, you know, walking through the creek, finding rocks, like doing all kinds of stuff. And I asked him about it. I was like, you know, what were you all doing? And the word physical activity or the mention of physical activity did not come up. And so I was very quick to point out, I was like, I just love that your family has a way to be physically active together that's not like related to you know, organizing a sport, but you all were just outside hiking in the woods, getting in the creek, that stuff. But also culture. Like when we start to define this out to people, like and Christy Malley used this phrase the first time I heard it, but it's like the invitation into the movement culture and not the sport culture. Like we all are to some extent ingrained in this sport cultures because we see it on TV all the time. But like, what is the difference between the sport culture and the movement culture? And how do we find ourselves within the movement culture around people who identify like us and support us in those journeys, whether it be oriented toward fitness or oriented toward expression or adventure. Like there's so many different ways of being within physical activity that are not organized sport.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And indeed, Scott Kretschmar, he talks about finding your playground, which is actually a really deep concept that he goes on to explain around a really strong magical connection that you have with that space for reasons that are often very personal. And is part of that sort of identity, is that self-efficacy, because if we're going to allow kids to find their playground or be invited into movement culture, they presumably need to be reasonably cognizant of like what the process is and what's going on around them. Now, I think certainly talking personally, I probably only made sense of that like way after I was heavily inducted into a movement culture, when I came into adulthood and for various reasons around curiosity and privileges that I had to reflect and study and learn about this stuff, I begin to join the dots, and it's a journey that certainly hasn't ended. I'm understanding, last week or the week before we spoke about, walking in the shoes of, and as you quite rightly touched upon, we tend to understand and can walk in the shoes of people who do certain types of activity. I'm not sure I can necessarily walk in the shoes. I could really appreciate what Oliver's family were doing. And indeed, on my move, which we come on to right at the end here, we were able to really capture and validate those forms of physical activity as really, really valuable. Back to this chart. So here in the UK, the definition of sport was tested in a court case, actually, where a group of organisations that are involved with brain games, so we're talking like bridge and chess, were trying to access public money, quite a significant amount of public money, that is earmarked for sport. And they were saying, no, some of that money should come to us because we're a sport. So then it had to be tested by lawyers and attorneys to figure out, well, what is a sport? And they reverted back to quite a well-established definition, a 3-part test, that a sport has to be codified, has to have rules, and those rules allow for competition, so it has to be competitive, and it requires physical and skillful preparedness. So that combination of things, and I always ask, like, if I go swimming, am I doing a sport? So most people who go to the pool, or indeed most people who run, are not actually doing the sport. I know this is a little bit of a pedantic sort of conversation, but they are over here. So when I go to a swimming pool, I don't come out of the locker room with a full tracksuit on, big earphones, dry smoke coming out, and I'm properly in the zone, and I might splash my face a little bit, take off my tracksuit, dive in, swim hard as I can for like four laps, and then finish, because I'm not racing anyone. I don't need that level of performance. I'm just going probably for fitness reasons. Some people go for relaxation, whatever, but I'm not competing against anyone. You might be competing against the person who's swimming in the lane next to you, but if they don't know that you're competing with them, that's probably not a sport. In the same way, when I get into my car, I'm not doing what Lewis Hamilton does on an F1 track. I don't know. Is it F? Yeah, F1's. It's growing in the States, right? Anyway, I'm not going to get into a conversation about F1. So I'm not doing that. There's a different purpose. So, and dance is always. Dance can sit in both, but dance is a little bit of an enigma here because it's got a completely different tradition. Dance is born out of performing arts. There is now, as we all know, competitive dance, but purists in dance are really not happy about that, are they? For them, dance is an expression of meaning through the body, in the same way as a picture or a poem is an expression of meaning through words or drawings and painting. Okay, so a little bit there, and then I've used like the teaching games for understanding categories of games here. It's not the best diagram in the world. I was having to move things apart around. So tell me if you use different categories. There's invasion, net, strike, fielding, and target games. But and then you've got like adventure activities that are sport, but then you've got thrill seeking that's not a sport. So again, like if I'm surfing. Now you've now got surfing in the Olympics, which I would say would be a wheels or sliding activity here. But again, purists who might surf in California or Hawaii or wherever, they're all about being at one with the ocean, and they actually really dislike Olympic surfing. They think it's a little bit of an anathema to what they're doing. So you've got this well-being route around, which is borderline, if not full-on spiritual. So like you've got like people who are really into yoga, people who are at one with their environment when they're walking, when they're trekking, when they're paddling, when they're surfing. You've got exploration sports, which are around traveling and finding the world. We've got I've split fitness into those who are seeking well-being and those who are seeking targeted outcomes, and they're very different processes. And then Justin O'Connor, Australian academic, he recategorized some sports in some very different ways, but we haven't got time to go into that. But making sense of stuff, and at the heart of all of these things is the essence of what you're doing it for. So I mentioned that dance is about expressing and conveying meaning. Well, if I'm teaching dance, I and the kids really need to know that, because that's what we're trying to do. If we're teaching games, we're trying to outwit the opponent. That's at the essence of what we're trying to do. There's no getting away from that. Higher, further, faster is around track and performance, athletics, etc. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I feel like I'm just going through a diagram.
I'll jump in really quick too with an example. My background is in coaching CrossFit, and I've held both a level 1, a level 2, and a CrossFit Kids certification. And one really important point that we have to do in the adult education of people who buy a membership is explaining to them that there's a difference between you and the CrossFit Games athlete, which is really fun to watch on YouTube. But when you come to the gym every day, like, we should not expect that level of performance from you, nor should you try to replicate it. And so while the CrossFit and the CrossFit Games are very different, the way that we communicate that to the athlete is like a 45-45-10 split. You should spend 45% of your time developing new skills, low intensity, develop the coordination for some of these movements, like not weighted, like unloaded. We want you to develop movement fluency. We use the term virtuosity. We want you to look like very complicated movements are as simple as can be. And that is a great outcome for what we're doing in the gym. Just learn how to move your body. The second 45% is training. Like, you bought this membership because you maybe have some well-being or fitness goals, and we want to help you meet those. And so a lot of what we're doing here is training the body, cardiovascular endurance, muscular strength stuff. And then we leave that 10%, and it's kind of optional. Like, if you're going to compete and you're just a regular person, you work a 9 to 5, but you're coming to the gym, but you're into this competition stuff, like maybe once or twice a year, sign up for a local competition or do the open every spring. Like, if you want to compete, like, you're welcome to do that, but do not expect to come in Monday through Friday and this be the CrossFit Games where you're tracking your performance against other people. That's a really detrimental way to approach, a physical activity that should be enhancing your life.
But that's the conversation you're having with adults. And I think that's a really important conversation, to have developmentally appropriate forms of movement where the context, the activity provides a context, and then that context needs to be adapted for the participant. And I would pick up on that, Jordan, and say clearly that has got to be amplified and exaggerated even more when we're talking about young people and children. what they might see on TV around these activities is clearly not what they're going to be doing, and nor should they be doing. And that's both from a movement perspective and also from a behavior and a values perspective. Kids who are playing tag on a Sunday should not be emulating the NFL superstars. They are playing for a really specific purpose. And, if we're really honest about it, some of those purposes are dark, some of the outcomes are dark, and some of the behaviors are unwanted or certainly not appropriate for 12-year-olds. So understanding how we take activity, adapt it for the audience, that also goes through to, therefore, what do we celebrate, bringing it back to the title of this session, because it's really clear what is celebrated in the NFL or in the Olympics or in the Premier League or in the World Cup, whatever major events we're watching, highly commercialized events. It's really clear what's celebrated. A successful outcome. Apart from those very few athletes that transcend above that and, start really looking and understanding the process, which in my book is actually a way to getting a successful outcome anyway. But it's not, satisfaction is not solely or even dependent at all on that outcome. I would say they're the coolest athletes who we really should be giving a bigger platform to, but that's my bias. The point I'm making there is around the relevance and the developmentally appropriate form of movement, and therefore what we celebrate. So the participation, the spirit, the development that the young person's making, the continued engagement or commitment. And it doesn't need to be about any outcome. It doesn't need to be. I mean, it could be, but that's a more complicated conversation. So here, why is it not changing? Okay, so I've taken the same activities and then understanding the hierarchy, because there clearly is a hierarchy. Even if we take, what you just said around CrossFit, in the gym, there's a hierarchy of who's super successful, who's celebrated, and people wear their bodies and they display their bodies in the fitness world because their body equals a sign of success. And if, as physical educators, I'm not sure how that works for us, and I'm certainly not sure how it fits in with Shape America's criteria for what a successful PE program is, because the most common word in that was for all students. And the most obvious thing around the hierarchy here is as you go up, the segments get much less in volume. So a hierarchy by its nature is exclusionary. Now, as physical educators, if we're serious about inclusive approaches and all young people developing that positive relationship and staying in physical activity, despite what barriers and challenges they might have in their lives, be them physical, social, whatever barriers that they got, and we've all got barriers, we actually don't want a pyramid. We want a big block. We want like a rectangle, or certainly an inverted pyramid would be cool, but a rectangle going up where nobody jumps out. Nobody feels I'm not good. Nobody begins to not identify as an active person. That doesn't mean everybody's got the same journey. As you talk about an awful lot, Jordan, it means each young person finds their journey. And so, we've spoken a little bit about why some activities are valued higher than others, and does that support or hinder your work? So any thoughts on like the last couple of slides there? The questions here, I guess, is just bringing things together, but the hierarchy of celebration or hierarchy of valuing some activities over others, does that sit with you? Does it make sense? Does it play out with your students?
I'm not sure really what's in my students' minds about this, but I know what's in the adults' minds, and that our identities as humans sometimes gets wrapped up in fandom. And if I'm a fan of an NFL team or a college basketball team, like I pay a lot of attention to it. And so it can become a source of conversation with students. And it can seem like that because I talk about this, that this is what I value. And I'm not really sure why exactly some activities are valued higher than others, other than the outcomes are so much more measurable and quantitative when we start looking at competition, wins versus losses. We start talking about meeting fitness goals. Like those are things that I can check off on a piece of paper and just be like, yeah, they did it, they did it, they did it. Whereas when we start talking about valuing movement and the outcomes of some of these physical activities that don't have the codification like you were talking about, maybe it's hard in the head of a PE teacher to wrap their head around the success of that. And how do I even measure a process rather than an outcome? One thing that I'm experimenting with my students is that they're just taking simple 30-minute, or not 30-minute, wow, that would be crazy, 30-second videos of them performing skills that are coming up within our unit. So again, like if I'm playing volleyball, like they might be recording themselves doing a bump or a set, and they just need a 30-second video, and we just play it on loop on a video editor, and then they voice over what they're feeling in that moment. And I do it at the beginning and I do it at the end, and I have them watch their two videos with their very visceral in the moment voiceover reaction to what they're doing, and ask them like, how is your language changing about what you see in your skill? Like what is the difference between day 8 versus day 1, and what success have we found? And I go back to talking about to you about this student I have. Her name is Kimmy, and when I'm reading one of her reflections, one of the things that came up was, when I came in this semester, I was really nervous about this class because I just don't feel like I'm very good at this class. And I highlighted it and I went to speak to her. I was like, what does that mean? What does that mean that I'm not good at this class? And a lot of what she gave back to me was all messages that people have given her about what it means to be successful in a PE class. And none of it revolved around her ability to engage with something and be reflective about it. And, in her post reflection, we found out that her confidence has skyrocketed. And my observations of her in class told me that. Like this student runs down the hallway to fifth period. Mr. Manley, Mr. Manley. She's waving her hands, pumping her arms. What are we playing today? Are we playing badminton again? Badminton's her favorite activity. On the first day of badminton, she literally asked me if she could sit out. She's like,
Wow.
I don't do well with a racket in my hand. I don't want to do this. I was like, well, why do you think that? Why do you think that about yourself? And really just questioning it, inviting them into a safer space where they can just connect with it. And by the end of the semester, she is like, today was our last day of PE, and we have to be in the health classroom. And she's like the biggest complainer. She's like, no, I want to go back to the gym. Like I was having such a good time. She's growing and she knows it. And so again, like we allow our bias, our fandoms to trickle into our curriculum. And the way that we talk about, a lot of PE teachers just grew up in sport. Well,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but like 90% of the students you're going to interact with aren't athletes. So, how do we address this, and how do we celebrate students who, aren't getting physical activity through organized sport? And, Mike Chamberlain told us last week, like those kids who are involved in sport, like they're getting some of this stuff elsewhere. Like they're going to get that high level competition that they're seeking, right? We don't have to like spend all of our class time doing it either. And so like how do we start to show our values through how we organize curriculum?
Yeah. Yeah. Beautifully put. I totally agree. Um, I think that first question, why are some activities valued higher than others? It really depends what perspective you're coming at this from. Sort of critical social theorists would look at movement culture as reflective of wider culture. And it's not an accident that competitive activities and competition and winning is so highly valued in a society where those traits are valued. Getting on means being better than others, means getting richer than others, means moving up the employment hierarchy. So these values are really common. Sport is both supporting that and reflecting that discourse. So and of course, who's doing the valuing, who's shaping the agenda, and that, whether we like it, whether we feel comfortable with it or not, does come down to who holds certain privileges and power in the world that we live in. So there's a big conversation. There's obviously been huge amounts written on that in academic circles. I'm just opening the window to that, or bringing that to the fore. And does it support or hinder your work? So a lot of the work that we try and do in education, especially when you go back to those shaped statements, this notion of for all is actually really counterintuitive, or swims against the tide of societal norms, because what other area of life apart from in education do you want all to progress? If we're living in an aspirational and inspirational world where kids are told they need to aspire to be better than others in order to get on, there's a tension there. So without dwelling on that too much, I was really liked where you went with that answer, Jordan, and I always come back to this, and I do find Meaningful PE a very useful framework. It's not the only framework, but the point I want to try and finish with is there's not only a hierarchy of activities and forms of movement, there's a hierarchy of why we move. So you mentioned badminton. We can play badminton in lots of different ways for lots of different reasons, but competitive high-performance badminton sits above me and you finding like a lot of joy and meaning from playing social badminton. It's just something we might do after work because, hey, it makes us feel good. We enjoy each other's company, and it's a great way to transition from work to home life. It might de-stress, whatever the reason. So there's a hierarchy of outcomes as well as a hierarchy of movement. Quick story. I was talking to a wonderful PE teacher today who, at the end of last semester, the kids she was working with were really flagging. It was a long term, and it was our year 11, which is your grade 12, I think, 16-year-olds, and a lot of PE here is gendered, so it was a girls' group in a co-ed school, and there was one kid, like you said, who didn't feel very confident with the racket, and she wasn't having a lot of joy. And Tara took out a balloon, and they started hitting with a balloon and slowed the game down. And all the other kids were enticed to that, and they all started playing with the balloon. And Tara, when she was recounting this to me, she said to me, "We just had a really easy, laid-back recreational session." And I said, "No, you didn't. Like, you've really demeaned your own work, especially with that ominous word, just. You've put just in there. And PE teachers are always demeaning our work. We just do this. I'm just a PE teacher." No, you're not. She's given that. She went on and told the story that one of the kids was having a really hard semester. She was really down for a number of weeks, and she left that room with a big smile on her face. And Tara said to her, "It's so nice to see that smile back on your face." There's no just in that process. She's made a call. She's created a really safe environment. And I said the follow-on is to do the reflective work and really capture that so that the young people can begin to really dive into what was it that put a smile on your face, and go beyond fun and really talk about the joy that they had or whatever the connection was. So I think that was a really rich learning experience. And she was saying it was just like an end of semester, easy going session. And if we're going to celebrate types of movement, we have to know about types of movement. This was one school. This was the data that we pulled out for them in my move. It was a primary school, an elementary school here in the UK. And over the course of last academic year, these were all the activities that their students took part in. 63 different activities amongst the school. And it wasn't a huge school. So if we want to celebrate forms of movement, we need to know how the young people are moving. And you've spoken about the reflections that the young people are doing on my move that you use at school, and this is how they're capturing all of this data. So we have to know, and my move does that for you. And I will finish with invitation for people to reach out on HP Collective, reach out via the My Move channel, and book a call with me, and we go through how My Move will help you do exactly what we've been talking about. Celebrate, and Jordan, you made a really cool point. Celebration not based on fandom, but based from an educative perspective in trying to move the young people through a journey where they all identify as an active person, because we're celebrating the activity that they're doing, whether it's Oliver wading through a river and looking at rocks and wildlife or nature, or whether it's a kid who's in a slip sliding activity and just loves being on a snowboard. Who cares? So can we arrive at a place where the process is recognized, the engagement is recognized, and the long-term sustained relationship is absolutely celebrated? So there's a challenge to finish this relatively short but always overrun webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Greg, for our conversation today. From us at the HPE Collective and HPE Radio, you're a great voice in our community. We love learning from you and with you. So again, thank you for organizing this webinar series of 6 webinars. Again, everyone who's listening, we'd like to thank you for listening to HPE Radio today, and we will be back with more next week. Have a great day.
Bye.